Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. The local time, 11:45 a.m. Pacific time. Can you hear me? And if you can, we will proceed with getting on camera and making sure that you know what's up. Okay, that's great to see. Thank you. 5x5. Wonderful. For those of you watching this in replay, the lecture will begin in 15 minutes. You can go ahead, scrub ahead 15 minutes to the beginning of the lecture. But we have some folks live here, and I'm going to get on camera right now, and we will say hi to each other. Thank you for being here. Still trying to figure out. Hi, everybody. Hey, great to have you with us today. Spectacular weather here. Who knows if we'll have a full crowd, because I don't know what the temperature is, but it's about as perfect as can be. Not only today, but yesterday and tomorrow. We were all out in the field yesterday having a great time. So I'm glad that I'm loud and clear. Let me say hi to a few viewers here on the laptop. We've got a little time before our lecture starts. And then when we get Skye Cooley rolling in here, we'll test his audio as well. So where are you viewing from, and how are things going? Menominee, Michigan. Garrett, the Dutch Night Owl from the Netherlands. Hello, Garrett. Lake Ozark, Missouri. Butler, Missouri. Cologne, Germany. Connecticut. Stratford-upon-Avon, England. Birch Bay, Washington. Sweden. Hello, Toulon. Australia. Hello. Charlotte, North Carolina. Wausau, Wisconsin. Red Rock, New Mexico. Zazuz in Belgium. Tri-Cities. Don's up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Vancouver, Washington. East Tennessee. Olympia, Washington. I'm down to live now. There's Rob. He's in New Zealand. Hello, Rob. And Gordon in a damp Glasgow, Scotland. Chelan, Washington. Rattlesnake Tough. Kay Edmondson is atop the Rattlesnake Tough. Salt Lake City, Utah. Bellingham, Washington. Copenhagen, Denmark. Slovenia. Hello, Matej. Paris, Illinois. Chicago, Maryland. Teza says hiya from Tasmania. Hello, Teza. Chad's in Moses Lake. Marion, Virginia. John's playing hooky from work right now. Brian's in England. Carlton, Oregon. It's damp in Dayton, Ohio. 5x5 though, reports Peter. There's Rob in Salem, Oregon, and Regine from France. Many of you are loyal viewers here, and it's so great to have you with us here today. We'll do a few more hellos, and then, I don't know, we already have plenty of the students here. My Geology 351 students are required to be here, but I think most of them would be here anyway. We have a nice flow going now with people attending these things, regardless if they have to be here or not, even on a beautiful day like today. But the weather has definitely boosted the spirits, and I've already heard all sorts of plans for people screwing around outside after today's talk. That's good. Kevin's in Mendocino Triple Junction, Eugene, Oregon, Toutle, Washington, sunny Oceanside, California. Hi, Jeff. Margriet is in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I'm missing Norley. I don't know about you. She's on break, taking a little break over in Africa, but I really miss her posts. I don't know about you. If you've been watching itchyboots.com, you got to love it. Vinman's Bakery, you got to love it. Lake Oswego, Oregon. Stormy Dallas, Texas. Holy cow. Come on over here. Straight out of the field. Yeah, straight out of the field.
How are you?
Jerome Lessman.
Hello.
How did it go?
It's great.
Okay. I can't wait.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right.
Very, like, more than worth the time and thing, and just, yeah, super duper.
Where did you camp last night?
We didn't. We were in Grand Cooley.
Grand Cooley.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks.
No. Oh, there he
There's
is.
your buddy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is Joel going to be here too?
Yeah, he's in there.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Okay. So let's say you're a loyal viewer of the channel, and you're not only familiar with these live streams, but also these recorded videos. We got these three guys in town together for the first time ever. Jerome Lessman, Skye Cooley, and Joel Gombiner. So we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon getting these three guys together. I'm just going to be kind of a fly on the wall, and they're all hanging out at the house tonight, and they've got collaborations in the works involving Ice Age floods and other Pleistocene type stuff, and Plio-Pleistocene. So Jerome and Joel Gombiner will be in the audience today, and no, Jerome is not taking over, but it's a blast. It's another way to say that we're out of our separate worlds and we're getting back together. It's just been delightful. And if you're surprised to see Jerome here, I guess you've missed the last 3 videos where we have been putting a big old spotlight on Jerome's work, and it's inspiring to say the least. Okay, a couple more hellos, and then I think the room's starting to fill in. Let me give you a sense of that. Adele, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Adele is in Auckland, New Zealand. A couple more locations, and then we'll turn you around here. Vermont, good morning. Bitterroot, Montana, I presume. Southworth. Greg, where's Southworth, Washington? Southworth. I don't know where that is. Gilliam Count, Oregon. Phoenix, Arizona. Pennsylvania. Auburn, California. Delightful. Okay. I guess you'll be able to listen in on Jerome's field report to Skye here, while also testing Skye's microphone. Thank you for joining us. We will begin our program in about 9 minutes from now. All right, you can stay right there, but we're going to turn you on and see if they can pick up your mic, and then you'll be live audio-wise, so stop swearing. Or at least tone it down. Would you tone it down? All right, can you read a couple of those so they can hear your voice? Do you recognize any places or names?
Greetings from Central Nevada. Greetings from Kamloops. Hey, Kamloops. Fraternity.
Can you guys hear Skye way over here?
5x5, both.
Garrett the Dutch Nada from dun-dun-dun-dun. Okay, good. All right.
Does he know Itchy Boots?
Yeah, right. Do you watch Itchy Boots?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Gorman, he's the artist. Gordon. Cool.
Okay. We're good. Well, you can continue to visit.
Okay. I'll just hang out.
And so I have said we're just not doing a dinner. It's just going to be us guys getting together. But we'll do a little, whoever wants to kind of visit, we'll just prolong it after in here. And then if somebody's really charged up, we'll just walk over and have a little lunch and talk to them. That will be our main other stuff.
Good thinking. Is Joel here?
Apparently he is.
Somewhere. Oh, it's over here. Maybe I'll say hi.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Oh boy. Can I show this?
You doing some landscape diagrams there? How are you?
Good.
Just fine. Getting the band back together here. That's what I feel like. Yeah. Where'd you guys come from this morning?
Waterville, Cooley City, Grand Cooley. We were out we had our coffee at 6:30.
It's a
And
haul.
went up to zoom up some of the Mansfield channels and stuff.
Cool.
And we split ways from there.
She's into it. I'm gonna swing you around.
I remember I got a job up there, and I was in Olawa, and I had an interview the next day, and I didn't realize how far it was. And for the day of my interview, I'm like 2 hours away calling, and I'm not gonna make it. And I'm still in Moses Lake, and I got 3 hours to go.
Yeah.
Anyway, man, that's a long drive, you guys. Jeez.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
We were in Omak the day before and around there, and Omak Plateau at the top there, and then we drove the rinkiest, dinkiest little unimproved road to get down to the Omak Trench, but it was good.
Huh.
And then,
I'm not sure I really saw that.
Some of those bed forms that are, and the other really like boulder bars
Yeah.
in many places.
I tried to combine everything.
What do you
that
think?
going on.
Yeah, there is. No, it's not.
And
It's
the
not
timing
simple.
is complex. It's not like
Really not.
Current topography.
I like it.
multiple different magnitudes, different. It's
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I
There's a
can
lot of
convince
things.
You
you,
need to find like
We're
an
gonna get that
Arctic
ice.
or an
Yeah.
Alaskan analog
Yeah.
Spokane.
I was
So you
gonna
can
read
see
that.
like
Yeah.
stuff happening now
Yeah.
and kind of go, oh, okay, this is just chaos, or there's some whatever continuity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that Missoula flood story has really nailed down some narratives. I mean, you brought this up, and it's like, just keep looking around. You're going to find a lot of crazy stuff that doesn't fit the model.
well, that's a huge sticking point. I don't know if we'll get to it, but
No.
Jerome's Tunnel Valley
Yeah.
is saying how you send
No, that's
water
right. That
uphill,
northern
like
tier,
crossing
man,
the
that's just
Columbia Valley.
open
It's
for
like,
you.
So
we're
I
under a
drove
lot
through
of
there before this week. Last weekend. I went back up to Omak, and then I went Omak, Republic, over and over, all the way to Spokane.
Kettle
basically.
Falls, yeah.
Yeah, Kettle Falls up and down. I went to, and then I came back the other way, and I went.
it is mountainous through here, but yes, that's worth a second look.
Spokane River too. Yeah.
Why don't we have? You're saying why don't we
Yeah.
have
I
channels
have
over
another
here as
segment
well?
where
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Fort Spokane,
Yeah.
and there's some fairly low.
Yeah, there's
So I'm guessing
the main
young
point
terrace
is
with
this is usually
multi-meter
presented
thick
as like,
packages
yeah,
of
there's
sand
nothing more to really,
at the core of those terraces.
nothing to
So
see
the
here.
fill-
We've got it all
Like the
figured out.
transport system's
These guys
a
are got
little
like a
funky.
huge eraser. They're just like,
I can do it after. I am still,
Right.
I'm bothered by the absence of obvious northerly sources of material in the sample. Because everywhere else you look, the ice sheet is clearly, so either there's a huge outwash plain that kind of dampens any sediment pulse that doesn't make it that far south,
Mm-hmm.
which sets interesting timing on what's open and ice free,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't know why. There's no reason for me in my mind why there shouldn't be slugs of sediment heading southward into the Lake Columbia Basin, or if it's post Lake Columbia, which might be the reason why that's post, right? But I can't quite reconcile that.
There's that northern end of the Sandpoil Valley is unincised. It's just amazing flat. Like at Republic, you're just kind of in this like, what's going on here?
But
And then you're in
down
Till.
the Kettle Divide,
Yeah.
down the other side, there's huge till packages, huge boulder gravels,
You're on
and
microphone.
terraces and levels and size down. So at some
check.
point,
Oh
there's
yeah,
something
I never.
shedding meltwater,
Well, I never knew his
sizing,
name.
dumping sediment, and sizing, downstepping these surfaces, like grade the surface. So why is there nothing in the freaking sandboard?
Okay, well that's a goal.
That was an upstream story, isn't it? It's a backward.
It's a wimpy lobe, or the lobe is so far gone already. But it's like, wow, that's totally. There's so much asynchronicity between them. Why? What are we missing?
I think that whole northern tier is just such an irregular ice margin.
Anyway,
It was always irregular and probably in different configurations. Are you
if you're
did you
inspired,
find any
stick
information
around,
in
we'll
the
just go
Spokane
over and
area about the
Jerome and
advanced
Joel
ice load?
right
Is there
here.
more?
Well, I was talking to
And
O'Connor.
so-
He's like, yeah, the ice is on the plateau
We're not-
at Fort Spokane.
dinner tonight.
Yeah.
I want these guys. It's
Yeah.
really the
Okay,
first time
Fort
they've been in
Spokane.
person.
Okay.
Fort Spokane.
If you wanted to be,
What about south of Spokane Valley, like east?
Well, south of Spokane, to me, the best case for that is the continuation of the Lake Pend Oreille into the Spokane Valley aquifer.
Mhm.
And then a new thing with the guy picture of this paper that shows this channel going right into
we're still
the heads
5 by
of the
5.
chain.
Can you
I'll show
hear
you
me? And can you hear
Yeah, it's
Skye
like-
right now?
Moments ago.
Sky's
I hope
talking to
you're.
Joel
I hope you're
and-
finding some
The
project
problem is,
there.
oh, there's a million, but very
Yeah.
circumstantial. It's tricky because a lot of it's kind of circumstantial, right? So it's kind of like, okay, here's
Thank
I don't know
you.
how you
Thank
you convert. Here's a interesting questions and hypotheses. Let's lay them out and then
Thank
let
you.
people
Thanks.
sort of play with them. I don't know what the right format to get that out. So, okay.
I think one of the lessons I've learned from Atwater is that he finds good
good that
backwaters,
Skye's
whether
louder
it's
than
his work on the coast of Washington or the Sandpoil. He always finds those quieter places that are off the main drag in order to resolve what's going on. And that's all you need is that one little key, that Rosetta Stone, and
I had to trade it.
maybe the Priest River area or something like that might be
might be
a little more productive.
Interesting, but it's working well. Really,
That's great. You guys are inspired.
some more.
Okay.
Much to say.
All right.
It's it was fun. I know O'Connor was. I didn't really know him, but
Oh, he's great.
he's really good and really open-minded about stuff. So he was like, I took him up to the what I would say are the Skye It was like, and eventually he's like, yeah, man, that's a fucking Cooley. So,
Yeah.
okay, let's go from there, right? How do we make this work? 5 minutes. Do we do this with ice? Like, what? Now we're gonna make Coolies out of ice? You know, with ice? Like, no, okay, I agree.
There is a transitional form in there, though, that it's like there's ice and then there's flood, and some of those features do get ambiguous.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Partly because we're incising through till
Yeah.
first, and it's all under ice, so that there's ice still doing something after.
Yeah.
It's okay too.
Yeah.
But it's like, I'm gonna try to.
This
Anyway.
is great. Okay, well, let's talk afterward. That's great.
I'm going to get rolling
Okay. What are we? I'll stand here.
wherever. You bet. Thank you. You're welcome to stand right up here if you like. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hey, now we got a full room. Oh, Jeff from Vindman's Bakery. We got everybody here. The energy is electric. Thank you. Is it the weather? Is it the fact that Nathan is here? I don't know. Is it the topic? Is the speaker? Is it all of the above? Regardless, let's embrace this energy that we have on such a beautiful day. Thank you for being here. This is a quick introduction of the remaining talks this spring, a quick introduction of our speaker, and away we go. We are not meeting next Friday. The following Friday will be Carrie Gauze's groundwater person here in the department. She will give a talk, Groundwater Storage, a Sustainable Water Management Solution. That's May 12th. And then the last talk of the school year, the last Friday of regular classes, June 2nd, Max Needle, talking about designing video game style field geology simulations and research and education. So 2 more to go. We won't see you next Friday, but this is the 3rd Friday in a row we've had talks. And our speaker today is from Montana. He drove over from Mission Valley yesterday, enjoyed a delightful night at Moses Lake. Is this thing on? And then is here this morning. So he arrived at 8 o'clock this morning. And you should just know, in case you've been following along, Joel Gombiner, who spoke here last fall, Jerome Lessman, who spoke last week, and Skye are collaborating on some new work. And so they're all here together the rest of the day. And so I'm going to let those guys get together and discuss all sorts of things. So we are not doing our normal 4:30 dinner. But if you would like to visit with Skye or Joel Gombiner or Jerome Lessman, I want you to stick around after the lecture today. And we'll see who wants to stick around. And if you're really fired up, we'll just walk over to someplace and have a little lunch and maybe a beer or two and enjoy the weather outside and just go for it. Okay? So the opportunity to operate, students, doesn't matter, and want to collaborate with all these experts who are with us today, that's an opportunity for you right after the lecture. Okay, today's talk is entitled Calcrete at Eastern Washington's Geomorphic Triple Junction. Would you help me welcome Jerome? No. Would you help me welcome Skye Cooley? Sorry about that.
No problem. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for your interest in Calcrete. Thank you, Nick.
You bet.
Hannah. And let's just jump right in.
Good.
Let me say a few quick words here. Thank you to Michael Machette. Thank you to Eric Cheney. Thank you to Jim O'Connor. 3 professional geologists that have been very helpful to me and have been incredibly generous with their time. So appreciate it, Michael, Eric, and Jim. Thanks for picking up the phone when I call. And of course, my lovely wife, Dr. Hillary Cooley, for allowing me to be a field geologist. So Calcrete in the Palouse Hills, the Channeled Scablands, and the Yakima Fold Belt. If you're anything like me, and I went to college in Eastern Washington, I learned about caliche by being dragged out to random outcrops in the Palouse. And I knew that it was important to understand something about caliche because important people would point at the outcrop and say, see up there, son, there's caliche. There's caliche. Caliche. But there was more to it, right? We had to learn about convex hill slopes and this cyclic pattern of dust deposition and stability and soil formation, and the migrating of these hill slopes, not quite dunes, but this migrating system of dust and paleosols with this odd little cement caliche. So I knew there was a box and there was an association with Palouse loess and caliche. But it seemed like there was more to it. And even back then when I was a punk student, barely able to get myself out of bed on time, I knew there was more to it. And I got that sense from my professors every now and then. If we just look at a simple timeline to kick this off, there are new discoveries going on in this landscape in Eastern Washington, and exciting stuff is happening. USGS, people like Lydia Staish and others are finding new stuff in the Yakima Folds. So that story is not completely told. There's new stuff going on in the Ice Age landscape, the floodscape. That story is not completely told. It hasn't all been done. And in the Palouse, when we talk about the Palouse, a lot of times what we're looking at is just this very youngest, thickest part of the Palouse loess. But did you know that dust and loess has been deposited on this landscape going back to the latest Miocene? But nobody talks about Pliocene loess or Miocene loess, right? So there's more to discover in this landscape. And I guess I would just encourage you guys, if you have that hankering for research in Eastern Washington, there is still an awful lot here that's wide open. And Calcrete is just one of those things. And as I've kind of gotten older and gotten away from being a student and done my own research, the more and more that message gets reinforced. There are new lessons to learn about stuff like caliche that we can update, right? We can update our thinking about the Palouse, the scablands, the fold belt, and things like Calcrete. So the goals of this talk are pretty simple. I'm not covering everything that I've been doing. I want to keep it fairly simple. 2 goals. Field observations. So I'll start out this talk with sort of setting up Calcrete. I doubt that a lot of people have really read up on Calcrete and are professionals in the Calcrete realm. So it's sort of an introduction to the setting. So I'll set up sort of the framework for how Calcrete works. And then we'll go through a series of examples in the field. So some pretty photos. And I want you to pay attention to 2 things as we go through this. Is when we look at deposits that are in relation to Calcrete ledges, what are those deposits? And where are we in the landscape? Okay, so what are those deposits and where are we in the landscape? And not really part of this talk, but eventually, maybe a paper or another part of this talk is a more academic thing to maybe revisit some of these ideas about how Calcrete actually forms. Not a big part of this talk. So what is Calcrete? Well, let's start with the basics. Soil science tells us a great deal because Calcretes are essentially paleosols. So let's start with some basics. You can make soil science complicated or you can keep it simple, and I prefer to keep it simple. Soil starts with a parent material, and that parent material can be bedrock or it can be sediment, in our case, sediment. You're at the ground surface, so you're in contact with atmosphere, you're in contact with pore water, and you're maybe even the groundwater table. We're talking about sediment or parent material, so we're in that geosphere, right? And then we've also got critters, bugs, mycorrhiza, rodents, bacteria. So we've got geosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere coming together in the skin of the earth. So soil starts with a parent material. You add stuff to the surface, whether that's organic material or dust or dissolved constituents, stuff in solution. You sort of mess around with that in the subsurface, both physically and chemically. You maybe add a little more and take out a little less, remove some stuff to groundwater. and you start to get horizonation. So soil horizons are a product of various processes that tend to make a regular set of horizons. Now, this middle diagram here is in every textbook, but you never see that in the field. I guess you have to go to Nebraska or Kansas or somewhere to see this idealized soil column, but that doesn't exist in the field. But what does is the one on the right. So we're talking about calcrete, and the environment for calcrete is typically a semi-arid, semi-desert, vegetated, some wet periods, but mostly dry. So a semi-arid climate. And if you're familiar with soil terminology, you know that the A horizon is sort of the superficial thing that you can kind of ignore. And then you move into the big time as you move down. The B horizon is our subsoil, so it gets subdivided. And BT is the translocation of clay. So you're picking up some clays in the profile. As you move down, you might pick up some more calcium carbonate. So the constituents of calcium carbonate are precipitating in the subsoil. So the dust is supplying the calcium, and rainwater and snowmelt are supplying the CO2, and they combine in the subsoil in the presence of roots and other things to form calcium carbonate or calcrete or caliche or duracrust or a petrocalcic horizon. So lots of names out there for this. Calcrete, a paleosol, a subsoil phenomenon, requires 5 things. It requires a dusty, dry environment, and that has to be in the presence of root respiration and the microbial community and the activities of the microbial community around plant roots. And you have to have water. Oftentimes, calcrete is sort of discussed in terms of this desert crust. But in order to grow thick calcrete, like what we'll see today, thick, meter thick, stacked, meter thick, blanket-like calcretes across the landscape, you need an awful lot of water. But it can't arrive consistently. It has to arrive in pulses separated by long periods of desiccation and water loss. So you need water, you need microbes, you need roots, you need dust, and you need a dry climate. Calcrete, like it sounds, is a hard rock-like substance. Calcrete kind of harkens to concrete, and that's about right. It's hammer hard, it's fully put together. But it's not some amorphous blob. There's lots of information. The morphology of calcrete tells you a great deal about its formation, its environmental formation, whether it's soil formed or other places where it might form. But its morphology has information to share. Dating calcretes is tough, and so people have given it the old college try a lot in terms of the U series dating. So uranium series dating gets you absolute ages. But because of the way calcrete forms in soils, we have some open system effects, and there's some assumptions you have to make with the decay of uranium. And so it limits the utility of standard tools like U-series dating. And so we have to fall back on a more traditional qualitative system that we call carbonate stage. And you guys are probably familiar with this if you've taken geomorphology or soils courses or anything. But stage is a proxy for age, but it doesn't give you 64,000 years or 220,000 years. It gives you a relative age. But it's a suite of predictable morphologies, and it expresses differently. So the progression of development of this soil changes in a predictable way through different materials. And we typically divide that into 2. Fine-grained parent along the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stages, and then coarse grain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just because of the way pore water works in sediments that are coarse versus fine. So again, Semi-arid climate, long-term surface stability in order to form thick calcretes, and water. Old soil textbooks especially, but most textbooks will kind of draw this calcium line across the country. And so calcrete is, that line is a little contrived, but calcrete is generally a Western phenomenon, right? We have mountains and intermontane basins. We have dry landscapes, especially across the desert Southwest. We've got these huge alluvial systems pouring off the Rocky Mountains that are forming the Ogallala Aquifer. But we've also got the Columbia Basin, and we kind of sit up here as this outlier to most of those desert regions. Calcrete was really studied in the US in the desert Southwest, in New Mexico and elsewhere. But we here in Columbia Basin have some world-class calcretes. We've got some of the best stuff anywhere, and it's wide open. It's a wide open frontier. If we talk about why we have calcrete west of this line and none east of this line, or calcium carbonate in soils, we do have calcium carbonate in soils east, in the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard and New England, upper Midwest. But it tends to get flushed through the soil profile because it's just a higher precipitation regime. So calcrete's a Western phenomenon. So where in Washington are calcretes? Well, here we get back to the title of this talk, the three geomorphic domains. So the channeled scablands, the Palouse, and the Yakima Fold Belt. And where these three overlap, we tend to find something a little more interesting than one or more of the end members. Okay, so my field area and the examples that we'll look at are from the Saddle Mountains, Othello, Frenchman Hills area. Here's the field area. This is looking southeast towards Tri-Cities. So sort of a Ellensburg perspective, I guess. So there's the Saddle Mountains. There's the Frenchman Hills, Quincy Basin, Royal Slope, Wahluke Slope. Lovely, bustling, influential Mattawa. Lind Cooley, or the lower end of Lind Cooley, Paradise Flats, or those benches around Othello, and then the Eagle Lakes, Scabland, and then White Bluffs. So this is the field area. Takes about 45 minutes to drive across it. East-west, takes about 45 minutes, maybe a little more than that, to drive across it north to south. My study sites, about 30 study sites. And I'm studying thick calcretes. And as you go north, they change character. They thin and just become something different. You go east, the same thing. You go south, you lose them. West, you kind of lose it. So there's this bullseye pattern of outcrops that mimics the landscape that, the former landscape that was crusted by calcrete. So each domain, or each one of these three domains, these geomorphic domains, it's a term I use, you don't have to use that, but Palouse Hills, Channel Scablands, Yakima Fold Belt. Each domain is quite distinct, and it has its own geologic history. But the people that study the Palouse are Palouse people. Lusaka, McDonald. There's about like 5 or 6 or 7 people that write on the Palouse. People that study the Scablands do Scabland stuff. That's like 20 people in the last 50 years. Yakima Fold Belt people, that's like less than 10 people. And there are rarely times when you see integrative studies across these three. Very rare. And so calcrete actually is one of those things that forms a common thread. That's what makes it interesting. This is what makes it interesting to me. Through the study area, I've drawn several topographic profiles, and it kind of puts it into perspective, or has helped me understand this landscape. The red line is this calcrete-bearing interval, so calcrete-crusted sediments. It's not more than about 20 or 25 meters thick at its thickest. Okay, so it's a fairly thin interval. Above the basalts, below the Missoula flood deposits, there's there's some room in there in the geologic time scale and the stratigraphic column to form calcretes. It's a different environment than what we see today and what we saw in the Miocene, for sure.
So you see this red line that's folded, warped by the Yakima Folds. This is Saddle Mountains. Here's the Royal Slope. Here's the Frenchman Hills and Quincy Basin up to Badger Mountain. So south is on the right. That's probably backwards what I should have done, but I was a terrible student. So let's see. If we look at both profiles, we see that that surface has been both warped, folded, and faulted, but it's also been chewed away and removed by Missoula flooding or scabland flooding. Here's Drumheller channels, for example, and the red has been removed. Here's Kuntz Cooley or Ringgold Cooley, spills to the Columbia, and then the Columbia Esquatzel Cooley and Old Maid Cooley down there at the south. So it's been removed, it's been folded and faulted. Calcrete demands certain things in order to form. So it's a product of an environment that's sort of since passed. And so it demands stability. And that surface has been disrupted. It's been uplifted in certain places. It's been buried in others. It's been removed in others. And the landscape that we look at today is an active thrust system. It's one of the most erosive places on Earth. And it's one of the places where loess has been burying the landscape for a long time. So there's not much stability in this. See, terrible student, forgot the D. Not much evidence of stability in the modern landscape. So it's something of the past that's still there. It's a remnant of past conditions. You've got undeformed calcrete ledges at valley positions today. You've got the same calcrete bearing interval 1,000 feet higher at the top of the Saddle Mountains. That was a fun day, Nick. Remember that? Smoky old day. When did calcrete form? Well, calcrete in the Columbia Basin, as best I can pin it down, is thick calcrete, not caliche. You can form caliche by just walking around in a circle long enough. But thick calcrete is really a product of a certain time. It's part of the Pliocene and part of the Pleistocene. So somewhere between 3 and 4 million, a lot of people pin that at about 3.5 million, and maybe as young as 100,000 years, maybe 75,000 years, somewhere in there. So the period of thick calcrete growth corresponds with sort of this climate stability through the end of the Pliocene, and then the beginning of the Pleistocene, and then change occurs. And we see, even though we still see thick calcrete growth, it's doing so in a completely different climatic regime. So we've got a cyclic back and forth between high sedimentation rates and stability. Instability, stability. So this cycling climate. So you've got both stable climate and sort of a cyclic stability and instability signal in your calcretes. Where's calcrete mapped in Washington? This is a beautiful little map, and it's too bad it's been obscure. It's in some it's by Kennedy Jenks, which is a very talented consulting group, but is buried in some reservoir report. This does a great job. Probably the best depiction of the Ringgold Formation. You guys familiar with the Ringgold Formation? So above the basalts, you've got a series of major rivers that are confluing somewhere around between Moses Lake and Tri-Cities. So the ancestral Columbia River, the ancestral Snake River system, Clearwater system sort of come together. And those sediments form a broad floodplain, plus you have some lakes that develop. So the Ringgold is sort of a fluvial system with a lake system capping it. And it covers a pretty big area. Generally, it's thought of as the Pasco Basin, but you can clearly see that Ringgold sediments are found even north of Moses Lake. It's a really cool map by Kennedy Jenks that shows where Ringgold exists. And there's always been, with mapping crews especially, sort of this rule of thumb. If calcrete if I see calcrete in float, if I'm seeing chunks of white in the roadside road cuts, if I see it in telephone pole excavations, then I know I'm near the top of the ringold. The calcrete is forming a cap on the ringold. That's kind of the way calcrete in the region has been thought of. It works for coarser mapping, but when you get down to the details, it sort of breaks apart. But the top of the ringold. So why do I study calcrete? Well, I've spent years looking at clastic dikes in the region and documented hundreds and hundreds of outcrops and thousands of clastic dikes. And most of the time I was pretty comfortable with the stratigraphy where these dikes occur. But this outcrop I stumbled onto, and it just was like, okay, wait a minute. There's my familiar clastic dike, but it's truncated and I've got this crazy stuff that I don't understand. And so I had two choices. So I could either say, well, I'm going to just turn around and ignore that and go in a different direction, or I could, learn something. And so I did. I dove in with both feet and said, I really care about soils. I don't really care about calcrete. I'm going to learn something because it meant something to the research that I was doing. So it was this outcrop, sort of a obscure place in the White Bluffs, hot as hell. And this outcrop sort of inspired me. Plus, in this sea of brown and darker brown and lighter tan of Eastern Washington geology, here's a bright white line, right? Here's this bright white formation that forms great, that frankly takes a good picture. That's inspiring. I like to take good pictures. And so here it was, something photogenic that looked good against the blue sky. But sort of more intellectual side of things, calcrete can't be understood apart from the sediments that it overprints. And so that's inspirational. So calcrete can't be understood. Okay, all right, so parent materials are important. And if you think about it, the study of parent materials is called geology. So it not only had the aesthetic part, it had sort of this geological meaning. And I was doing some work that was related, so I was hooked. So let's walk through a series of places in Columbia Basin. Most of these are within that field area, but not all. And look at the relationship. Well, let's look at some thick calcretes first. And I want you to pay attention to what the strata are telling you. So what is the sediment that's being crusted over? What's the parent material? What's underneath those calcrete ledges? And then following on, where in the landscape did those things get deposited? So those two things. What's the sediment and where in the landscape are we? Here's George Gravel Pit. I imagine people have been out there. It's really a nice place. There's some deeply weathered basaltic gravels. There's fresh basalt in there too. There's also some chunks of quartzite. There's chunks of vantage sandstone, and there's some granite. So this is definitely a flood deposit. We've got south and east dipping foresets. It's definitely a flood deposit, but we wouldn't really know how old it is if we didn't have that crust of calcrete on top. That paleosol puts us hundreds of thousands of years into the past. Okay, so it's a cool old pre-Missoula flood deposit. An hour and a half east of there, same stuff, out at Harder Road. Now I've always been told it's pronounced Bing, Washington. Who knows the correct? Is anybody from Bing? There's like 4 people in Bing. That's what my dad told me, and he grew up in the basin, but some people disagree. Same flood gravels, crusted over by most of a meter of calcrete. At Fancher Bar, we're in the Columbia Valley, right off the river, thick gravels, unconsolidated flood gravels along the Columbia Gorge, crusted by a 4-meter interval of sediment and calcrete. It's not all calcrete, but a thick rind on those ancient flood gravels. Thanks to Jim O'Connor and Richard Waite for sending me that picture. This has since been lost to gravel mining, but it says something. So where are we in the landscape? Think about where we are in the landscape. We're at Wenatchee. in the study area at Othello, right out of town, is this beautiful place with these two thick calcrete ledges. Now, the base of the section is important here because that's kind of the bedrock that we're basing this on. So the Pliocene Ringgold Formation is our bedrock. And that upper Ringgold is laminated silts. It's a lacustrine system. It's lake beds. It's very distinct lake bed sediments. And this first ledge is developed into that parent material. So Pliocene lake beds and a thick soil on top of or developed into those lake beds. On top of that, you've got this red layer that is essentially a loess, and then another calcrete soil. Okay, so the conventional way we think of the calcrete interval or this calcrete bearing strata that sits above the Ringgold is it's probably Pliocene, right? It's probably Pliocene. I showed you to that age or that timeline that says, yeah, Pliocene is a perfectly acceptable age for this lower ledge and maybe even this upper ledge. A short distance away, we have the same two calcrete ledges, ledge 1, ledge 2, the red stuff in between. So loess here, a soil here, and a soil here. But here it's different. Out of sight and just below the photograph is that same bedrock, the same Pliocene lake bed. But on top of that is a boulder gravel. And that's an ice age flood boulder gravel. That's Pleistocene. And so we've inserted Pleistocene where in the past we may have just assumed it's Pliocene. And the difference is big. It might not sound big, but it's a big deal to be able to pin down when the Pleistocene started and when the Pliocene ended out here. There's not a very clear relationship. So this was a new discovery that I made in 2018, 2019, and kind of separated the Ringgold, which is below the photograph, from what's on top. And what this boulder gravel does is it pushes this calcrete that's developed into that boulder gravel and this loess and the 2 meters of calcrete on top of it fully into the Pleistocene. So we've got thick, young petrocalcic horizons that are as thick as anything, anywhere in the desert Southwest. These are spectacularly thick soils. Other places, the association is a 2 meter thick calcrete ledge developed into overbank deposits with incipient wetland soils. Okay, where are we in the landscape? The same stuff, that gray, green, reduced, glade sediment, wetland deposits, muck, overlain by most of a meter of calcrete on the north flank of the Frenchman Hills. Here's 2 meters of calcrete overlain by Missoula flood gravels, developed into, so the calcrete is developed into floodplain overbank sediments of the Ringgold Formation. So lowland sediments here, Cooley bottom sediments here, and calcrete in the middle. So we're fully in the lower portion of any landscape, right? We're depositing gravel. We're not on some cliff. We're not on some high ridge. We're not on some raised terrace. We're low in the landscape. Marengo is a classic site, and I wish I had a better photograph, but have you been to Marengo? Anybody been to Marengo? Yeah, it's sort of out there in literally the middle of nowhere. Marengo shows the same relationship. There's a gravel at the bottom, which puts us either in the base of a stream gravel. This might be a flood gravel. It doesn't matter. It's either alluvial or it's an ancient flood gravel. Doesn't matter. There's a loess pulse of dust and a soil stable period. A pulse of loess, a soil forms. A pulse of loess, a soil forms. And then, even though we've graded 3 or 4 meters of section here, so the ground surface has been rising by several meters, again, we're at the base of a coulee. So we're actually low in the landscape this whole time. From here, we're in a valley, and here, we're at the base of a flood coulee. Up in Joel's field area, I got dragged out there by some senior gentlemen. Joel couldn't make it for some reason. Coyote Creek up in the Moses Coulee area. Coyote Creek's a major tributary, fairly dry, flat. The Calcrete ledge, it sits on alluvium of ancestral Coyote Creek. It's overlain by loess and some weak soils, and then these really cool deposits, really a new discovery, different facies of Missoula flood deposits up there in Joel Gombiner's field area. Joel dated this. Remind me, Joel, is that correct? 220,000 years? Could be. Okay. Great. I always love that. The guy who published his papers goes, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, whatever. Okay.
The data is scattered.
All right. Very millennial of you. Okay. Whatever. Old Calcrete in association with alluvium in a channel. If we look at a little closer to home on the flanks of the Saddle Mountains, Smyrna Bench is an excellent laboratory for sedimentology and stratigraphy. You have long run-out gravels of coarse alluvial fan gravels moving out over flat-lying, fine-grain alluvium. The bedding in this stuff below that abrupt contact and below that hoe, so this stuff, the bedding is flat-lying. The contact parallels the bedding. And the bedding, as you can read it, in the fan gravel is also almost parallel to that contact. There's a slight angular difference. But these are basically run-out fan gravels onto the valley floor. At White Bluffs, which is north of Tri-Cities, been to White Bluffs? Anybody been to White Bluffs Overlook? Awesome place to go. This is one of those classic field stops where hundreds and hundreds of geologists have gone. And steps from the parking lot, I was able to make some new discoveries. When I was out there, let me just start here. So here's my friendly neighborhood Ringgold. This is our lake bed system. So laminated siltstones, lacustrine, sluggish, fluvial. But over that was this curious gravel. And it took me a couple visits to believe my lying eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing because I had never read anything about it. Never read any mention of this famous stop that hundreds of geologists have been to, saying anything about a calcrete gravel, just composed of ripped up calcrete. Took me a couple visits to kind of sort that out and believe, not turn around and walk the other way. But I kept poking around. This gravel is 99% rip-ups of calcrete. So an old calcrete ledge was swept by high-energy water, chewing it up, transporting that sediment as a gravel. Well, you start looking around a little closer, and there's all sorts of non-basaltic clasts in that gravel. You'd think that'd be in a guidebook. It's steps from the parking lot, and it's 2 meters thick. So I dragged Richard Wade out there, dragged Jim O'Connor out there, got Michael Machette out there, dragged a group of geologists from Seattle out there, and some folks from Montana, and they all agreed, yeah, that's what we have. We've got ringgold bedrock, essentially, so lake bed sediments. We've got a thick soil on top of that, and between we have 2 meters of flood lane calcrete gravel at White Bluffs. So this is an ancient flood deposit, but it's not basalt and gneiss and quartzite. It's almost entirely calcrete. The association, again, if we look at diatomite in the George Washington area, diatomite forms as shallow, warm, enclosed, non-draining pools atop bedrock surfaces, basalt surfaces. So closed basins, shallow, warm, and the diatoms go crazy and they build up thick deposits of their tests. And that's low in the landscape. Flood basalts, especially when they're thin, are following topography. They're seeking the low place in a landscape. And this thick calcrete that sits on top is also low in the landscape. If we look at other people's work, here's some sections, and I'll zoom in here. Kevin Lindsay is one of the great Eastern Washington geologists that just shuns the limelight, but Kevin Lindsay is someone you should have in if you can do it. Kevin wrote a really good paper for the state of Washington on the Ringgold Formation back in the 90s. And tucked away in the appendix in the back is this like hand-drawn, cut up, paginated series of measured sections, really valuable stuff. And he put a ton of work into it, but it was sort of formatted to be useless. So I just redrew it and recorrelated what he had. And let me walk you through this briefly. What we're looking at is the upper part of the Ringgold Formation. So the Ringgold is a fluvial system in its lower part, and then it becomes a lake system that spills and fills and spills and fills 3 times. Okay, so we've got 3 different lake beds in those colors, blue, pink, and light blue. And so this lake number 1 fills and then it spills. And the surface left abandoned didn't have much time to accumulate soil before the next filling. Okay, so that at this contact, we see just these blue triangles, which are diatomite, which is kind of always trying to form. So not a soil crust at that low stand surface. But lake 2 fills and then spills. And the time between its spilling and the next filling was considerable because that dry, abandoned lake bed accumulated thick calcrete soils, deeply weathered basalt, plus some diatomite, plus some ash, and some other things. So these bars, these red bars, are calcretes, paleosols. So a lake fills, it drains, that abandoned plain has time to accumulate dust and soil and a crust because we're in a semi-arid environment at that time. So this second lake bed accumulated thick calcrete. The third lake bed isn't well preserved in these sections, but it is elsewhere. So again, imagine where we are. We're on lake bed sediments in an abandoned surface. We're low in the landscape. If we look at classic studies, if you ever read a paper on calcrete, there's going to be like 4 references in the first paragraph. And one of those is going to be Michael Machette, 1985. So this is a classic study. And Michael studied places in Colorado, places in New Mexico, places in California, Nevada, and places in Utah, so the desert Southwest. He studied calcretes that increased in stage up to the maximum stage. So this blue, as it gets bluer, just means we're increasing stage. So he's looking at very old calcretes. All I did with this figure is just look at the formations, which are written here behind, just in black text, and just figure out which ones of those are alluvial deposits. Which ones of those formations are basically just like floodplain deposits or alluvial fan deposits, and almost all of them are. So there's a strong relationship, even in the classic studies, in another region, strong association between calcrete and alluvium. And it comes back to this. So this concept of relative topographic position is fairly simple, like me. If you're high on a summit, you're relatively higher than something below you and something below you. So high, medium, low, relative position in the landscape. Even though you're not on the highest summit, maybe you're on a sub-summit. Maybe this is Mount Rainier and this is Little Tahoma. You're relatively high if you're here, right? You're relatively high. Everything around you drops away. So maybe you're not the highest place around, but relatively, you're either high or low. So vice versa. Low is low. if we look at loess hills, floodplain, alluvial fan, and flood coulees, one of these things doesn't fit the pattern of calcrete in Columbia Basin. So thick calcrete we saw associated with floodplain alluvium, overbank paleosols, that gray-green stuff. We see heavily cemented calcrete bearing alluvial fan gravels. We see calcrete caps on flood gravels, whether they be actually low, like at Fancher Bar, or not so low, but relatively low in other coulees, like at Taunton Bench. But loess hills never satisfy this equation. We just don't see thick calcretes in the Palouse, even though I learned about caliche in a Palouse context, but we really don't see thick calcretes in this environment. Instead, we see them in deep coulees, shallow coulees, alluvial fans, floodplains. So this caprock concept that you'll read if you ever get into literature on calcrete always comes back, but it's important to understand that capping calcretes are almost always associated with alluvial deposits, and this was the former valley floor. It's since been incised, and there's the modern valley floor. So our familiar diagram, and we can say that in the West, we're talking about calcrete in alluvial valleys or calcrete in alluvial fans and filled channels. I'll just finish with this. This part of the world where this field area, this Othello, Saddle Mountains area, has been a low spot for a long time, millions of years. The subbasalt topography or the subbasalt structure is kind of a bowl. The basalt's filled that bowl, and we see that here. Neogene sediments, or stuff that's been deposited on top of the basalts, also filled a depression. This is sort of the remnants of a once more contiguous basin. So these are basin fill sediments. Big rivers have conflued in this region for a long, long time. And the Ice Age floods, if you actually look at the pattern of flooding, things tend to converge here as well as Wallula Gap. But this is where floods are trying to get to, the Othello area. Like everyone, right? Othello, yeah. So calcrete, caliche, maybe it's time to update our ideas about Eastern Washington caliche. You don't have to call it calcrete, you call it whatever you want. I call it calcrete because the USGS makes me call it calcrete. Some of the conclusions are these. Calcrete is not caprock. It's not something that forms high in the landscape. It's almost exclusively a lowland deposit. Thick, pedogenic calcretes in Eastern Washington are intrinsically related to the presence of a valley. Calcrete requires aridity, stability, long-term stability, and vigorous evapotranspiration. The drier it gets doesn't have anything to do with the thicker it gets. You need water. You need pulses of water to create deep, thick, blanket-like calcretes as we have here. And calcrete today occupies an elevated position in the landscape, especially at places like Saddle Mountains. But it formed as a lowland soil. It's a crust on a fluvial terrace, a sloping alluvial fan, or the gravel on the floor of a coulee. So maybe recalibrate your idea of what you see when you're seeing caliche versus calcrete. And when you see thick calcrete, think lowland alluvium. Okay? Thanks, you guys, for putting up with a lecture on calcrete.
Thank you, Skye. Questions for Skye, and he's going to repeat your questions for the home audience.
Yeah, go ahead.
In simple terms, what's the difference between caliche versus calcrete?
No difference.
What's the question?
Same stuff. The question is, what's the difference between calcrete and caliche? It's the same stuff. Exactly chemistry, formation-wise. caliche just is a colloquial term that works. People use it. Yeah, I think Calcrete sort of came out of papers from USGS in the 60s. There was a benchmark study done by Guile et al. And that term arrived. The term caliche was sort of penned in the English language in 1902. The term Calcrete, same time. One was in Ireland, one was working in the desert Southwest. So just like Calcrete and caliche are kind of misunderstood, it starts right from the beginning. The terminology is confusing. We should probably just pick something. Yeah. Other questions? Covered a lot of ground there and probably not real familiar territory, but if you've got questions, let me know. Yeah.
Skye, I have a question about the dating methods. You
Yeah.
briefly mentioned uranium series. I'm guessing a lot of that work would have been earlier U-series methods that are more bulk or kind of mesoscale sampling. And I was wondering if anyone had revisited that using microanalytical techniques. So there's people doing U-series dating using ion probe or even laser-based methods where you can really get at that fine textural detail, and given the complexity of what those examples, it seems like you might benefit from a technique like that. I was just wondering if anyone has started doing that.
Yeah, so there have been modern attempts. This is not stuff that's buried in the past. Actually, there hasn't been a lot of past U-series attempts. Most everything is in the 2000s or younger. And the attempts have been to sample carefully and to try to get, if you think of Calcrete building up kind of in layers as maybe a crust on the bottom of a cobble, the idea is to get right down to that first crust right next to the bedrock and sample there. And so that's been the attempt, and it's been done by capable people, but it just seems like the best you get is a minimum age. And so even with modern, I mean, would you say 2004 and younger is reasonably modern as far as U-series? Yeah. Well, a gentleman named Paces, who's a USGS lab dude, skilled, experienced, that was kind of Columbia Basin's first. And then I know Lydia Stace sent some stuff off. She's a USGS geologist. I'm not sure who did that work, maybe the same lab. Joel, where did you send samples?
To the MIT lab.
Okay, I guess MIT's reasonably well qualified.
Okay, but not like tens of micron scale.
No, not.
No.
Okay, drilling out powders and then dating those. Right, yeah.
Seems like there have been a couple papers that have just sort of warned the community that this is tough to do. There are open system behaviors in pedogenic calcretes that just sort of confound some of that dating. Somebody's going to figure it out, but right now we're still stuck with sort of traditional geology. Yes.
So you have ice age flood gravels below some of these calcrete layers. Does that mean that they were deposited much earlier than 20,000 years ago?
Yeah, almost everything we've looked at, if it's below a calcrete ledge, it's hundreds of thousands of years ago. So to repeat your question.
I think they heard mine.
Okay, they heard yours.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there's an older flood story in the Missoula, in the Scablands. There's an older landscape, and it's oftentimes sort of squirreled away in a couple paragraphs. But there's a huge story there about the pre-Missoula or pre-late Wisconsin or pre-Wisconsin ancient floods, hundreds of thousands of years old, that have sculpted the landscape that later floods occupied and modified themselves. So when we talk about Missoula floods, not all of that quarrying was done by 20,000, 20 to 15,000 year old floods, the Missoula flood cycle. A lot of that quarrying had to have been done earlier. And once you get into the Pleistocene, there are strong glacial, interglacial periods, And so matching up sort of time scales to, well, maybe this is 130,000 years, and then you have to jump to the next glacial cycle, and then the next glacial cycle. So there's sort of an increment where you have to step back in increments of time, but it's hundreds of thousands of years, and probably at some of these sites, 1 million years of soil development. Easily hundreds of thousands of years. So floods occurring hundreds of thousands of years ago.
And those really old floods, can you tie them to Glacial Lake Missoula? Or there's no data below those calcretes to say that's Montana water versus flood water from elsewhere?
Yeah. Well, the record is much more sparse than the Missoula flood record, but there's easily 20 sites in the Scablands that are, no question, old flood beds. The source of the water is never talked about when you talk about old floods. Never talked about. Great avenue for research.
Thank you.
Yes,
More
sir.
questions?
You said you can't really use the stage of the Calcrete development to determine absolute age,
Yes.
but can you do it relatively? So like those areas with 2 Calcrete layers, if a higher layer necessarily be an earlier stage of development.
Yeah, good question. So you can't.
Could you repeat?
So repeating his question, so you can't absolutely date using the carbonate stage system. That's not what it's for. It's a relative age system that uses morphology. But yes, you can. To answer your question, yes, if it's higher, it's younger, right? Just basic geology. But you can also compare what we have here in Columbia Basin to other sort of benchmark studies around the world and get a relative feel for where we sit in terms of development of calcrete. And we are definitely in the thicker end of things. These are impressive paleosols. So did I answer your question?
So
Yeah,
then does
good.
thicker necessarily mean bigger?
Sorry, say that again?
Thicker necessarily mean bigger?
Yeah, no. And that's an interesting question. There is an implication in some of the older research that as soils on terraces become abandoned, so higher and higher terraces are typically older and older, that soil continues to develop as that terrace gets abandoned and abandoned and abandoned. So the oldest terraces keep developing over time. The difference is here is that these are buried soils. And so the idea in soil science is if you bury a soil, it kind of shuts off the process. It's a fossilized soil. So thicker doesn't really seem to equate to age as much here. There's kind of a 0.5 meter to 60 centimeters or so consistent pattern across this part of the basin. It's somewhere between 50 and about 80 centimeters before you get new sediment and then another soil. It's somewhere in there. But yeah, that's a great question. There's more to that, but I think I'll just leave it there. Great question. Yeah, Jerome.
Maybe a follow-up to this one. I view what you're saying as a very much top-down process. You alluviate to a zone where you're going to have your calcrete. Because that's not, this is what I was taught.
Yeah.
Soil,
Right.
How much of a bottom-up process can it be? So you're showing lowland sites. I expect those to be wet.
Yeah.
How much is vadal zone and groundwater fluctuations a way of accelerating the development of the calcrete and the thickness?
Yeah,
of some sites?
that's right.
Purely wet, right?
That's right. That's right.
Wet to dry, wet to dry.
Good question.
Can you repeat
So
it,
the
please?
association of calcrete to the water table, right? How far above the water table are we? Well, some of these are clearly above the water table. These are clearly like soil features. You're overprinting old cicada burrows and root casts, and there's obvious dry soil indicators. But some of them are not. Some of them clearly show groundwater morphologies. And so this is the thing, and this is kind of the argument that I'd like to make maybe in a later talk, is to really tease out. The soil textbooks say it forms here, high in or relatively high in the landscape, sort of unattached to the groundwater, sort of removed from a groundwater system or even the capillary fringe. It's like, yeah, we don't really talk about that. But other textbooks don't. They relate it directly to the capillary fringe. And I think that's right. I think this area gathered water and has been gathering water from the region for millions of years. This has been a low spot for a long time. And that low spot has never been, the Calcrete is developing just outside of that water table influence. Like I said, you need dry, you need dusty, you need plants, you need microbes, but you need an awful lot of water transpiring through that soil. And if you're sitting perched just, centimeters above the water table, that's the perfect place to grow calcretes thick. So you're right on. I mean, you're taught one thing in soils, but probably we're more influenced by a nearby groundwater table than anything here. Yeah.
Greg in Tennessee wonders, how long does it take to form a calcrete?
Well, tough question. I don't think any of these thick calcretes in Columbia Basin are less than 75,000 years old. And some of them are clearly 300,000, 500,000 years old. There is a question on whether or not calcretes form quickly and then get buried and sort of shut off. There are different ideas about, do calcretes continue to build even though they may get buried? I don't think that's the case. So calcrete is forming over tens to hundreds of thousands of years.
Thank you. How about two more questions and then we'll break it up here.
Let me ask the professor.
Skye, what about climate in this whole story?
Yeah.
You've said dry a number of times, but what's the limit in your field work? We know there's calcretes here, and you've got me thinking now, how far west could I still find
Yeah.
calcretes?
Yeah.
Can you find them up the Okanagan? How far into the Palouse can you find them as we get wetter and wetter away from this kind of core area?
Yeah.
Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, so the question is, how far beyond this field area, this Othello, Saddle Mountains, White Bluffs area, can we find calcrete? Well, it's a definitional thing. If you call caliche calcrete, you find it everywhere in eastern Washington, but it's this thin and it's wispy and there's 10 layers of it. When we're talking meter thick or half meter thick calcretes, it's a very limited supply. If you go north, you lose it. I mean, by Davenport, you're dealing with sort of this, you're back into caliche territory. You're just sort of in this, it's not really the same ball game. If you go towards like Natchez, not thick calcrete there. You typically have that later Palouse loess, really young Palouse loess, but you don't have that foundation like we do out here of old loess. It just doesn't seem to be out there. And the caliche there is typically kind of that wispy, thin stuff. If you go east into the Palouse is a complicated beast, but I'm saying that most of the Palouse is young. And what we're dealing with here is kind of at the bottom, the guts of the Palouse, and is not expressing as ledges like it does in the Othello area. You tend to, so if my arm is a ledge here in the Othello area, as you move east into the Palouse, you tend to fan out. And I think that's what's happening. You're sort of dividing that system because you've got a higher sedimentation rate to the east and a lower sedimentation rate here in the basin. Different plant life, definitely different topography, different vegetation, more moist. So all those probably combine to separate calcrete into, wispier layers. There's certainly some developed calcretes out there, but they're nothing like here. Nothing like the Othello calcretes. Great question.
One more question, maybe from a student. Yeah, Robin.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so are there other like meter thick calcrete deposits in the world, or is
Yes.
the ones in Washington kind of just like a one-off?
Not at all. Not at all. Those yellow areas of the West in North America anyway. But yeah, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Australia. Australia mines their calcrete because it hosts gold. So there's these, vast areas of ancient crusted landscapes through the interior of Australia, and they're just stripping it, so. Well, it's, where do gold deposits,
Calm down, Robin.
what are the two ways gold occurs? In veins? Yeah, it's in veins, it's in native gold, or as a secondary thing in alluvial systems, riverbeds. Okay.
Hey,
Good-
let's thank
question.
Skye one more time, please. Come on up if you want to visit more with Skye. Thanks for coming. Goodbye.
Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna just keep this on you. I'm gonna turn this off. And I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody, but you'll have some visitors here and then we'll just morph off that. Thank you. Okay, everybody, I'm going to say a few more words before we sign off here. Okay, I thank you for joining us today. We have a good rhythm going now. We're going to take a Friday off next Friday. So I don't know if this might be the peak of the energy. The energy in the room was outstanding today. The soils talk, for goodness sake, essentially, but I think the visual, you can decide for yourself, but I think the visual nature of it, Skye's pace, and the application to many different kinds of Eastern Washington geology was the key to explain the rapt attention in the room. I mean, the students are getting fried, you know, it's almost May. We're on the quarter system. We go till the second week in June. So this is always kind of the midterm blahs. But the weather's a big part of this, and everybody's kind of re-energized by application to field work. And my Geology 351 is going out in the field every Thursday. Some are in geomorphology with Carl Lilquist. They're going out every Tuesday. Geology 489 is a summer field course. Those guys are going over to Wenatchee tomorrow doing some mapping in Dry Gulch right below Saddle Rock. So there's the Geology Club is very active. So there's tons of stuff going on here in this department. And you're welcome to join us. You're welcome to join us if you're a potential student that wants to study geology here at Central. And yeah, we have more guests in the room today, just older folks who just came in because they're a fan of Skye. So we want that going as well. I do see, you know, I'm monitoring the live chat as well as playing with the cameras and everything during these talks. And part of me wants to involve you a lot more, but you know, we've got a vibe in the room. I don't want to break that up. So I only got to one online question today. Thank you for coming, Jeff.
See ya.
Okay, thanks, man. So yeah, part of me wonders, just like with the pop-up geology things I was doing the last couple of summers, part of me wonders if I can use the live chat more. I think the answer is yes, but I still don't really know how to do it when there is an audience, you know, in the room as well. That's a tricky one that I'm still trying to figure out. But this one's gone on plenty long, and I think we can look for you know, there's Joel Gombiner right there. So between Gombiner and Lessman and Cooley, different combinations of those folks, I think there's some interesting work that's going to be coming related to the Ice Age floods and beyond in the next few years. And things are happening right now. It's very exciting to be a witness to that. Okay, thanks everybody. I love you and goodbye from Ellensburg, Washington, USA. We'll see you live in a couple of weeks, and I have a couple of recorded videos that I'll be posting in the next few days to keep this momentum going. There's plenty of momentum, and it's energizing. Thank you. Goodbye. End stream.
There was no roots all below.
How old do you think?